do the recorded presentation and ask questions of the WACA and Bowser staff to really answer questions and be able to provide feedback on some of the presentations and everything. There will be a live presentation coming up later in July, so will be more info coming there, but definitely review that webinar and provide questions so we can help answer questions on the latest WACA rulemaking updates that will be taking effect in August. So take a look at that email if you didn't get it. Your payment may have lapsed and you may not be a member anymore, so make sure you're up to date there. But that's just kind of a quick housekeeping item. We have a couple groups for our July virtual forum. So the Nature Conservancy and the Pew Charitable Trusts will be presenting. So we have Maya Swope from the Nature Conservancy chatting about peatland restoration in Minnesota and opportunities to increase restoration opportunities for climate change mitigation potential. And then we also have Andrew Werthmann from Pew Charitable Trust talking about policy venues, technical needs, and successes to incorporate some of the conservation measures and restoration of wetlands and discuss some efforts about the National Peatlands Map. So there's no questions for me or the WPA board members. I'll hand it off to Maya and Andrew.
Great, yeah, thank you so much. And I actually, Jasmine maybe also is going to help kick us off as well. I'm not sure if she can unmute herself if she has that capability on here.
Okay, can you all hear me? Hello? Okay, perfect. Thank you. I just had to fidget with my microphone settings there for a second. Had a little bit of a panic attack. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen, so just bear with me for a second. Okay, can you see my screen? Yeah, okay, perfect, thank you. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting us to discuss the emerging opportunity to incorporate high carbon wetlands into state climate planning. So just to give you kind of an idea of what we'll be covering today, I'll be giving an overarching kind of look at the climate policy space for wetlands, and then setting the stage for Andrew and Maya, who will speak more in depth on Minnesota peatland efforts. I think we'll also have a couple of minutes at the end for clarifying questions, so just please hold on to those. So with that, my name is, again, Jasmine D'Agostino. I'm an associate on Pew's U.S. Conservation Project. For those not familiar with Pew, we're an independent, nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to using data and science to address complex policy issues. So our work spans various areas from fiscal policy to public health and the environment. Today, I will be focusing specifically on our domestic work under the U.S. Conservation Project, which advances plans and policies to address climate change and create a more adaptable environment for people and nature. So kind of nested within this broader U.S. Conservation Project, our small team works and focuses on advancing policies that elevate the role of wetlands as a natural climate solution at the state level. So our overarching goal is to move the needle on the protection, restoration, and management of high carbon wetlands, ensuring that these ecosystems are integrated into state climate action plans. So the policy venue by which we work is often called natural and working land strategies, which kind of in a nutshell means improved land management actions that can help reduce emissions and then enhance carbon sequestration while also, of course, contributing to adaptation, resilience, and biodiversity. So it may not come to a surprise to any of you that nature can really act as an ally in absorbing and storing greenhouse gases. But states are increasingly recognizing that better management of what these natural and working lands are can enhance carbon sequestration while also providing additional resilience and adaptation benefits. That being said, while these actions are of course not a substitute for reducing emissions from sectors like, say, transportation or industry, EPA's latest report does note that natural and working lands remove 13% of gross US emissions and really underscores the importance of including them as integral components of these climate response strategies. So natural and working lands policies are a relatively new policy arena. They really gained traction after the US withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. So the US Climate Alliance, which is a bipartisan coalition of 24 governors, has been really a driving force behind these strategies, working with states to help them scale best practices for integrating natural and working lands into state mitigation as well as resilience plans. Just to note that Minnesota is a member of the Alliance and has developed its own natural and working lands plans under what is called the Minnesota Climate Action Framework, but more to come on that later. So what exactly are these natural and working lands plans? Natural working lands plans cover land management on a variety of landscape types, so including ranches, farms, grasslands, forests, and of course wetlands. So the goal is to identify and implement practices that reduce emissions, prevent emissions through, say, something like protective actions that avoid conversion of wetland ecosystems, and finally seek to expand carbon sinks, which could include peatland restoration, for example. So these plans typically include a carbon assessment, which could entail something as basic as estimates of existing carbon stocks in the habitat, to a more sophisticated assessment of carbon emissions and removals for that habitat. So these inventories are then used to set targets and management strategies to move beyond what's called a business as usual from a greenhouse gas perspective. So you may be wondering, why is this important, right? This is crucial because wetlands, especially peatlands, have immense potential to store carbon, yet they're often overlooked in favor of other habitats like forests, which are more mature in their science and kind of tend to dominate these natural and working lands conversation. So including wetlands in climate policy are essential, right, for several reasons. One of them being it helps secure protection and restoration measures for these valuable and often vulnerable habitats. Two, it ensures that they're mentioned and monitored and tracked over time. And three, it unlocks significant public and private funding, as was seen by the Inflation Reduction Act recently and the bipartisan infrastructure law, along with NOAA and EPA grants. This was also the case most recently with a round of funding administered by EPA through the Climate Pollution Reduction Grants, which provided funds to states, localities, governments, tribes, and territories to combat climate change and by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then here on this next slide, I just wanted to give you kind of a brief example of what these management actions and targets are. And so these can range from kind of broad practices that simply say like conserving tidal wetlands to kind of more specific acreage goals for these habitats. So, and again, kind of a noteworthy state is California, that recently released its targets for national working lands this last spring, and included ambitious targets for both coastal and freshwater wetlands. So just by way of background, our work on nature-based solutions for addressing climate change started back in 2021, when we launched a new effort to protect and restore coastal wetlands that capture and store what's called blue carbon, with the goal of helping states develop carbon inventories to better account for these habitats, and then use that data from those inventories to set goals and targets for conservation and restoration. This work was driven by a new body of research that pointed to the carbon mitigation benefits of coastal wetlands, coupled with also the fact that in 2017, EPA started including coastal wetlands on its national greenhouse gas inventory for emissions and sinks, which then drove and provided an opportunity for these states to incorporate measures to better protect and restore these ecosystems. So what we've seen is the incorporation of coastal wetlands into state natural and working land strategies for climate mitigation has really come a long way over the past 4 years, with multiple states now developing carbon inventories for their coastal habitats, and also setting goals, as I kind of showed for California, for their natural working lands as kind of part of their broader climate goals for their state. Now, what we've been seeing kind of like similarly to coastal wetlands is that we've learned that peatlands are also overlooked in these plans, and could use a bit of help and a boost to integrate them more regularly into discussions around climate mitigation and also adaptation. So recognizing this, we have really expanded efforts to elevate the role of peatlands at both the state and national levels as a natural climate solution. And just to kind of leave you with a little bit more background, presently peatlands are only included in EPA's national greenhouse gas inventory if they're actively mined. And because they're actively mined, of course, under the inventory are considered net sources of greenhouse gases. So to change this and kind of create and develop a new narrative for peatlands all around, we need additional data to comprehensively include these habitats into mitigation and adaptation strategies. So just a little bit more about our work. So our work looks different in every state, but Pew primarily focuses on convening experts, supporting research, and most importantly, engaging in policy efforts. So often we find that those responsible for developing these greenhouse gas inventories are based in air resources departments and may not necessarily be deeply connected to the natural resource management and land use planning for their states. So we kind of try to bridge that gap by bringing together scientists and policymakers. And on a somewhat related effort as well, in 2022, we launched the Blue Carbon Network to help states share best practices and tackle common challenges. This network facilitates collaboration through webinars, which we tend to hold regularly, resource materials like case studies. So far, we've released 3 on primarily blue carbon habitats, and in-person convenings as well. Now, the Blue Carbon Network right now, as the name states, it's only focused on coastal wetland ecosystems. But since we have a platform here, I'd be curious to hear from the rest of the group if there is kind of a need to also extend and expand this network to include freshwater wetlands as well, and for this network to kind of extend across state and disciplines as well. Okay, so returning to peatlands for some cool peatland facts, because I know we all love those. So in the US, peatlands cover only 1.2% of the total surface area, but hold an impressive 18 to 20% of the nation's soil carbon. So this is roughly equivalent to the carbon being sequestered by 60 billion acres of forest in a single year. Conversely, and as you all are aware, degraded peatlands tend to be net sources and emit in the US 47 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually. And so that's kind of roughly equivalent to the emissions of 11 million cars driven for an entire year. So kind of in short, peatland conservation is imperative for maintaining existing carbon stores in the ground, and restoration is then necessary for reducing those emissions once a peatland's already been degraded. And I think Maya might touch a little bit more on this later on as well. Okay, just bringing it back to Minnesota. Peatlands, of course, are unmatched in their carbon storage capacity. The state has 6 million acres of peatlands, the largest in the lower 48 states. And those store an estimated 4 billion, not million, billion metric tons of carbon. However, when these vital habitats are degraded, they tend to shift from carbon sinks to significant carbon sources, as I mentioned. And kind of to make matters worse, degraded peatlands are also highly susceptible to catastrophic wildfires, which then drastically increases the emissions generated by these habitats. So as you all know, there's a lot at stake if we lose these ecosystems because they provide critical benefits such as flood prevention, wildfire mitigation, and improved water quality. Again, not to mention that they also hold great cultural significance and support diverse ecosystems and communities all around. So despite their kind of role in carbon storage, peatlands are often left out of, like I mentioned, these climate strategies due to the lack of detailed nationwide data, which is why Pew right now is working on with experts, mapping and carbon experts to develop the first nationwide map of these habitats that identifies both conservation as well as restoration hotspots and their associated climate benefits. Currently, the data on peatlands is not detailed enough to be actionable at a state level or for state level planning, meaning that the information is not detailed and accurate enough for states to clearly understand where peatlands are located and their climate impacts, such as carbon emissions or removals from these habitats. So this all to say that there are many unknowns. And then to add to that, much of the soil data in the US is also outdated. And although there's efforts by universities and federal agencies who are conducting pretty exciting research to improve data and mapping, these efforts, as we've found, tend to be either siloed or disconnected. And yet another layer to tack onto this is that there is no real consistent definition of what constitutes a peatland, which kind of leads to discrepancies in data and data collection methods. So better understanding peatlands' extent and carbon dynamics is essential for integrating them into US inventories and of course frameworks, like I've been saying, to really ultimately help us to fully leverage their role in climate mitigation. So just a little more on this map. Developing a map, as you know, and many of you may be aware, is no easy task. So to aid us in better understanding the available resources and data gaps, we convened 2 expert workshops earlier this year, comprised of folks from academia, federal agencies, state agencies, as well as nonprofits and other researchers. The first workshop specifically focused on peatland extent. So figuring out here some of the basics. Where are peatlands found across the US? What data sets are available out there and at what scales? So one of the initial challenges that I kind of previewed for you was defining what constitutes a peatland. There isn't an agreed upon definition. So what we kind of attempted to do was establish a kind of consensus early on that encompassed kind of the majority of relevant areas based on our goals of conservation and restoration for these habitats. Discussions at our workshops highlighted several subnational tools that are available that could be scaled up to kind of address some of these gaps, especially gaps in the USDA's CIRCO data set. Speaking specifically to our second workshop, which focused on greenhouse gas removals and emissions, we wanted to see kind of what relevant data sets exist for carbon stocks, fluxes, and emission factors. So we explore how existing data could pinpoint priority areas for conservation and restoration. So just to kind of finalize here, some of the key findings included the decision to use CIRCO data as kind of the foundation for our map, and then supplement that with more detailed data that's available for locally in states such as North Carolina or Minnesota, who tend to have great data for peatlands. And it became clear again here that, states like Minnesota will have better data than others. So we established that just because there is a lack of peatland in a specific area, that does not necessarily mean there isn't a peatland there, but rather that there isn't sufficient data as of yet to include it in the map. So as far as next steps, we are in the process of developing a roadmap based on workshop discussions that outline methods, key data limitations, and kind of other assumptions needed to develop this national map, including a timeline and what are the resources that are going to be needed to build something out like this. So we are working currently with a contractor to develop this roadmap and hoping to have a draft map ready by spring 2025 that can then be used to get feedback from folks. After that draft map, we're also planning on holding a third workshop. This one will specifically focus more on the communications and policy needs and opportunities to leverage this map specifically to catalyze policy and management action. Timing on this is a little bit up in the air, of course. It's a big effort, but we anticipate it could take place in late spring or summer 2025. Okay, and just to close us out here before I hand it over to Andrew, I'd like to highlight some of the national developments that are relevant to Minnesota, such as the Freshwater Challenge, which was released this last spring. So this initiative sets bold targets to protect, restore, and reconnect 8 million acres of wetlands nationwide. It's particularly noteworthy that Minnesota has signed on to this initiative, which is great to hear given the extensive wetland coverage in the state. This step kind of combined with significant investments from laws like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act really holds a lot of promise for elevating the profile of peatlands in U.S. climate priorities. It's also important to note that, work at a state level, anything, that this organization would also be doing can also feed into national efforts that can contribute to stronger commitments nationally. This is particularly important in the wake of the recent Supreme Court decision of Sackett v. EPA, which resulted in the loss of federal regulatory protections for many of the wetlands. So that is kind of climate policy for wetlands in a nutshell. I will pause now here, take some clarifying questions if there are any. If not, I will hand it over to Andrew for questions or for his presentation. Seeing no clarifying questions, maybe I will hand it over to Andrew.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And let me just make sure I share here. Hang on a second. Okay. Is that working? Hopefully everyone can see that. Great. Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Werthmann, and I have worked as a consultant with the Pew Charitable Trusts since 2009 on various environmental campaigns. I'm actually based out of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, so not too far away from everyone, and cover the upper Midwest for Pew. My role is really focused on helping elevate the voices of leaders throughout our region as we work on policy challenges. Currently, what that means is supporting Pew's effort on state level policy around greater protections for peatlands, in Minnesota, and on another campaign that is focused on the importance of old growth forests in the national forest system as a way to elevate and strengthen forest health and resilience. As you all well know, Minnesota has a long and proud history of forward-thinking policy around natural resource conservation and protection. To name just a few of those, the Wetland Conservation Act, the Land Conservation and Management Statute, the Peatland Conservation Act update, as well as the Land Conservation and Management Statute, the 2008 Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment, and recently the 2022 Climate Action Framework that encompasses forests, natural resources, transportation, clean energy, pollution, as well as many other policies that help bolster the state's environment and ecosystems. Additionally, there have been a number of structures in place to foster collaboration between agencies within the state, different levels of government, as well as non-governmental entities. As it relates to Minnesota's peatlands, the Wetland Conservation Act, my apologies, I'll go back here. The Wetland Conservation Act, the state's scientific natural areas, the SNAs, and ongoing efforts by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources around the creation of a lowland conifer designation. It is true to say that there have been important steps made toward peatland conservation in the state's management efforts. However, given that that peatlands within the state cover roughly 10% of state lands and store an incredible 37% of terrestrial carbon within the state, it is important that we recognize the lack of standalone definition for conservation purposes and major policy gaps that continue to let peatlands across the state deteriorate. Throughout our engagement with local stakeholders, agency experts, and others over the past couple of years, it has become clear that there are certain barriers toward establishing stronger and more targeted peatland protective measures. First off, I think we recognize that the value of peatland conservation is not as visible compared to other landscapes, something that we feel contributes to a huge knowledge gap and awareness relating to their importance. There are, as Jazz mentioned before, these stressors from impacts of logging, metal and non-metallic mining, as well as peatland mining, all which are ongoing threats to the state's peatlands. Moreover, many areas of peatlands within the state are faced with a legacy of drainage, ditching, or land conversion for agricultural purposes. These drying effects from ditch systems, as well as a changing climate, continue to cause peat to decompose and release carbon into the atmosphere. Understanding these challenges, Pew's U.S. conservation team, as well as the Nature Conservancy, have been considering various policy avenues to strengthen peatland protection and conservation within the state. I'm going to run through a few of those concepts here with you. I think first and foremost, as many of you are aware, in 2025, the Minnesota Climate Action Framework will be going through an update. And this could be a real opportunity to potentially include measurable goals on carbon that encompass carbon stored in peatlands, as well as to identify peatlands in a stronger way to match the state's overall climate resilience goals. I think one of the things here to recognize is, and it needs to be spelled out in this framework, is the huge benefit that peatlands have in carbon sequestration, established policies or provisions toward its restoration, protection, and long-term conservation. I think on a larger scale, we would hope to have a stronger, relatively consistent language referring to peatlands throughout official documents, legislation, and policies. Second of all, I think is to bolster and support conservation work of state agencies. That includes Bowser, DNR, MPCA, and looking at policies to create longer-term sustainability of Minnesota school trust lands. this is one area that has kind of consistently come forward. As folks know here on the webinar, DNR manages school trust lands currently, and these lands make up roughly 40% of the overall portfolio. And while school trust lands have a fiduciary responsibility to create revenue for schools, we sort of recognize that this is a pretty low amount in terms of what it creates for schools, for school funding. At the same time, we see a recognition that long-term management must align with the changing realities on the ground, from pests to disease to wildfire and changing climate conditions. While most of Minnesota's state-managed lands have been adapting to new realities, it's clear that the school trust lands lag far behind which puts a lot of peatlands actually at risk. Lastly, looking, I think, at legislative approaches that strengthen peatland preservation, I want to point out that in this last session, the legislature took an important step, allocating over $500,000 for U of M research, as well as creating a new peatland manager position at the DNR, along with other meaningful steps. But as is usually the case with the legislative process, compromises were made to get that bill through in 2023. For example, cross-agency working definitions of peatlands was left out of that bill. And one concept that many have talked about is looking at the possibility of a Minnesota-centric carbon onset model that would, instead of traditional offset models, would essentially align Minnesota's drawdown goals in the climate action framework to preservation of state peatlands. This is something that we've heard consistently could be an idea, would probably take legislative action to put in place. But we think there are a number of models and ways that this could be addressed. Besides these potential routes, we are also hoping to support and promote funding efforts within Minnesota agencies for easement programs, restoration, and protection projects. Working with tribal partners is also another opportunity to integrate Indigenous wisdom in enhancing peatlands' environmental, ecological, and cultural values. Furthermore, we are also interested in opportunities to support tribes as they are working to access federal funds to restore peatlands. And this directly relates to their drinking water resources in many parts of the state. To conclude, we are excited about numerous opportunities to address the primary drivers of peatland degradation in Minnesota. By collaborating with diverse coalitions across the state, we believe we can develop comprehensive policies that recognize the unique needs of peatlands and enhance their long-term management, conservation, and protection. Together, we can ensure that these vital ecosystems continue to thrive and contribute to Minnesota's resilience for generations to come. Thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to Maya.
Great. Hi, everybody. Good to be here. There is a very intense thunderstorm going on behind me in Minneapolis here, so hopefully that does not come through my speakers. Let's see here. Okay. So yeah, hi, my name is Maya Swope. I work with the Nature Conservancy. We are a global nonprofit devoted to conservation, climate, biodiversity, but I work for our local chapter representing Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And one of my main roles is as a project manager on our peatlands work. So we've been able to work with Pew a lot in the last couple of years, and have done a lot of work on the ground here in the state. Let's see. So I know you probably are very familiar with peatlands and just got a background. One of the reasons that we're so focused on them is because they cover quite a lot of Minnesota. Depending on what estimates you look at, Minnesota contributes up to 7% of the total global peatland area, and up to 10% of our state itself is peatlands. So they're a big portion of Minnesota and of our landscape, but also are home to a lot of rare and unique species, and of course have the carbon storage potential and capacity, which is so important. And as was mentioned before, some of the main threats include climate change, the legacy of ditching, as well as some other type of threats like mining. As Andrew mentioned earlier, healthy peatlands are a carbon sink, but drained peatlands are a source of emissions. And so this is just a little bit of graphic. Maybe you've seen something like this before. I know this one has floated around a lot of different places, but showing that in a healthy peatland, the water level, the water table is pretty close to the surface. The peatlands can act as a sponge, both for carbon and for water. We're seeing, sort of really healthy storage of the partially decomposed sphagnum moss and other plants. However, in these drained peatlands, we see a water level that fluctuates a lot more, and we see floodwaters flowing through a lot more quickly, as well as the release of a lot more carbon and methane into the atmosphere. And the reason that is such a huge issue is because of the amount of ditching that we do have in Minnesota. So this map, the red shows altered water courses. So a lot of that is ditches. Some of that is like straightening of a stream or something like that. And maybe if you're working in wetlands, you might have seen something like this before, but you can see that a huge portion of our state has been impacted by ditching or similar types of things. And so this drying of peatlands and release of carbon is really playing out in a lot of different places. And that brings me to what the Nature Conservancy is doing to work on peatlands. So we have sort of a three-pronged approach, although I would say it keeps expanding to, we could probably add many more bullets to this list. But we started out by working to estimate carbon stocks and carbon sequestration potential in peat. So kind of trying to identify how much peat do we have, where is it, and what is the condition. We also have been working to think about the benefits and the feasibility of avoided peatland conversion, so making sure that intact peatlands can stay intact, and also re-wetting peatlands, and so keeping that peat that has not yet decomposed, keeping that intact. And then from both of those things, we're working to develop some recommendations, working with partners like Pew and others to think about how we could implement this on a statewide level. So we sort of started this process with looking at maps and sort of trying to figure out what questions we actually wanted to answer. We landed on these sort of categories of questions. Where and how much peat do we have? Looking at things like ownership, conservation status, things like that. How much carbon is stored and sequestered by Minnesota peatlands? And then also where are the priorities for implementation? And I won't dive into all these data layers, but this just gives sort of an overview of some of the types of data that we gathered. There's a lot of different information, out there related to wetlands and peatlands across the state. And so it was a matter of just figuring out which ones were applicable, relevant, and could help us try to answer these questions. And then all of that we overlaid with this altered water courses map, finding that there's more than 40,000 miles of altered water courses in Minnesota, and about 7,000 of that intersect with histosols or peat soils in our state. So just to try to boil down the mapping into something a little bit more simple to read, these areas here highlight some of the sort of the hot spots for where we think potential for peatland restoration could be. So these are areas with a high density of ditches and also a high density of peatlands. So that represents places where peatland restoration would make the most sense. We see that there are about 280,000 acres of what we're calling these potentially restorable, partially ditch impacted peatlands on public lands here. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But these are kind of the general areas we see sort of like northwest of Duluth and north of the Red Lakes. To throw a lot of numbers at you, this is how it breaks out a little bit by ownership. So we see really the bulk of peatlands in the state, especially the intact peatlands, but also many of the ditched peatlands are under federal and state ownership, more so than the other categories. For the state ownership, we see 5.7 million acres, so that's really a huge chunk of our state. And you can see it broken down in the darker green here by some of the different designation types. And of this, I'll point to, I guess, the school trust land, which is about 2.5 million acres. That's a big potential opportunity there, as well as many of these other categories have some really significant acreage when we're thinking about places that we could restore. And so that brings me to kind of the restoration itself. Our team at the Nature Conservancy, we have a peatland scientist, Mark Felice, who does a lot of really great field research. And with that, we're trying to answer the question of, when we plug a ditch, when we re-wet a peatland, what does that actually do to the carbon and methane fluxes in that system? And so Mark has been out the past 2 summers, or last summer and this summer, trying to help figure out the answer to that question and nail down some of the variables so that as we're working towards more large-scale peatland restoration in the state, we can make sure it's successful and try to sort of get the most bang for our buck in terms of the work we put in and the carbon benefit that we see from it. So again, the field research here is really focused on estimating the impact of peatland rewetting on carbon dioxide and methane fluxes, but also, yes, some of the small scale variability, like how much does the microtopography matter? How much does a vegetation community matter when we're thinking about the carbon benefits of restoration? And I'll note, so Mark is here on the left wearing this fancy backpack sampler, and this is how we do our measurements. It's with a Lycor trace gas analyzer. Mark has some PVC collars out at these different sites, and he puts this gas analyzer over it to measure the carbon and methane fluxes coming off of the peatlands. And that's been a really useful way to get sort of some of these time snapshots of what's happening in our different sites and across the growing season. So the bulk of the research is focused around these 3 sites. We had 2 sites in 2023 last season, and we added an additional one this year. We have a drained site, so that's a site that has a ditch on it that has not been plugged or repaired or anything. You can see it here in this first photo. We have a re-wetted site, so this is the site of the Lake Superior wetland bank. This was a project that started, I think, around 2015, but it's a huge wetland banking project on a peatland area. And so we've just come in a little bit later to measure some of the impacts, the future impacts of what that project did. And you can see here in that middle picture, this was EIP and SEH were 2 of the companies really involved in that project. And here they were filling in one of the ditches, so blocking it so that the water would not be able to leave the site as quickly. And then finally, we added what we're calling our intact site this year. So this is a peatland that has not been drained ever. As far as we know, it looks like a healthy peatland. It has sort of the typical like bog communities that you would expect in a healthy peatland. And this is going to be kind of a control site, and it's also a site of our partners at University of Minnesota and some other organizations who have a LCCMR project where they're going to be installing a flux tower, basically to monitor the carbon and methane fluxes coming off of this site. So we'll get some extra data from that site, and that's kind of why we added it this year. I won't go too much into the details of like the specific design, but these are just some images of the drain site on the top and then the re-wetted site on the bottom. These points, these little aqua points here represent our monitoring wells or our monitoring collars. And you can see like, you know, they're sort of spaced out in a transect away from the ditch. So our initial results from that show, as with most any science project, that greenhouse gas emissions are variable, that methane emissions are generally highest close to the ditch in the restored systems, and then they're lowest near the ditch in the unrestored systems. And we're also seeing high methane emissions from the open water on the ditches. And then we're also noticing, as expected, that there is a correlation between water table levels on these different sites and the carbon dioxide emissions. So we see higher water table levels are associated with lower carbon dioxide emissions, which is what we expected, and is great that that's showing to be true at these sites. And then this is just a close-up of one of the chambers that we use to take these measurements. You can see it kind of seals over the PVC collar there in the ground, and the sensors can measure what's happening with the greenhouse gases within that over about a 2-minute time period. So a lot of our work really has been trying to combine what we're learning in the field and what we're learning in our mapping and apply that sort of in the real world, trying to make actual peatland restoration projects happen. And all of that is done through partnerships. We've been working on this for the past couple of years and seen that there's just a ton of interest across the state. I know some of you folks on this call have participated in various meetings or things that we've hosted, but that we see a need for more coordination. There's a lot of different organizations, different state agencies working on this, and not necessarily a lot of like sharing of data or cohesion in terms of planning for the future, planning for large scale efforts. This is a list of just a few of the folks who have worked with us. There's many, many more who are working on peatlands, but just to show you, there's a lot of interest here. Lots of people are coming at this from different angles. One of the things that I wanted to mention through these conversations and talking about scaling up, we're looking at possibilities for, you know, how do we actually fund this on a large scale? And we see possibly wetland banking or carbon markets as something that could play a role in that. That's something that we are kind of exploring and trying to figure out like how that might work and how that might interact or supplement public funding and private philanthropy to be able to do some of the projects that we're interested in. And then finally, just to kind of highlight a few of the things that we've learned at the Nature Conservancy working on this for the past couple of years. Just wanted to, I don't know, I guess touch on again that large scale peatland restoration will really require partnerships across large jurisdictions. A lot of the potential restoration sites that we looked at are some complicated matrix of state, federal, private land, tribal land, like lots of different ownerships. And so we'll have to keep working together in order to make some of these things happen. Also wanted to note that the potential for ditch abandonment could be a good place to start as a relatively inexpensive like step towards restoration. So a lot of the ditches that I've mentioned before are actively upkept by counties or by other sort of local authorities for drainage purposes. And while some of that probably is necessary to, you know, not flood out homeowners or keep the roads accessible, there probably are a lot of those areas where those ditches maybe could be not continued to be dredged, and that could serve some benefit for the peatlands up in those areas. And then finally, there is sort of a public perception that I think will be continuing to work to overcome related to peatlands, sort of swamps that need to be drained, and people wanting to make sure that any potential restoration projects, you know, near their homes or businesses are not going to have any negative impact on flooding. Most likely, any restoration project, as you all probably know, would have a positive impact on reducing flooding, but that's not necessarily how it's seen in a lot of public opinion. And then just finally wanted to mention that we have what we're calling our Minnesota Peatland Playbook coming out very soon. Hopefully it's sort of getting the final copy editing touches this next couple of weeks here, but that will detail basically all of this information that I've been talking about, plus a lot of the actual numbers and details and maps. And we're hoping that that will be a tool that, agencies or land managers can use to help work together on peatland protection and peatland management. So stay tuned for that to come out. But yeah, here's my email. And yeah, I just wanted to shout out our rest of our peatlands team at the Nature Conservancy. And I'm happy to take any questions. I see a question from Doug in the chat. Are all healthy peatlands carbon sinks, even considering methane release? I guess I don't know 100% the specifics, but I think in general, yes, that the carbon storage generally in a healthy system would be outweighing the methane release, especially sort of over the long term. That's one of the things also that we've been thinking a lot about when we're talking about restoration. So when we're going from a system that's drained and has a ditch, and we plug the ditch and re-wet it, and we have some sort of standing water, changing those dynamics, we do see a bump in methane, but so far at least, and we're sort of working on some more details here, but so far it seems like that increase in methane emissions will still be sort of outweighed by the benefit of carbon dioxide sequestration when we were talking about restoration, at least.
And just to add to what Maya said, just from what we've learned, that generally rings true, that with peatlands, it's like what is stored on the ground really makes a difference, right? This like carbon has been storing for millennia, and yes, peatlands do produce a certain amount of methane, but when you compare that to degraded peatlands that are releasing CO2 and methane, there's still very much of a case for conservation of intact peatlands so that that stored carbon is not released back into the air, and then restoration of degraded peatlands so that you don't get kind of the double whammy of like carbon and methane at the same time.
Yeah, and I see the follow-up question here. So with the initial results, yeah, I'll have to check that that is still the case. This was after our first year of our field work. Now we've got a second year sort of almost under the belt here. But we're seeing that in the restored systems, the methane emissions were highest because of all of the standing water sort of near where the ditch was, and that they were lowest in those unrestored systems, not necessarily in the ditch, but in the areas that were adjacent to the ditch that were sort of drained with a lower water table. So hopefully that, hopefully that clarifies, but I'm not the one that knows the details of that science. Maybe Chris, who I think is here, although probably can't unmute, can add to it.
Oh, well, there it goes. Yeah, now I'm unmuted. But yeah, so Doug, what were you asking? Oh, maybe you can't hear.
Okay, sorry. Now I can unmute again. So Doug, yeah, Doug had mentioned surprised by the methane release near the ditches, and I'll just copy this as sort of like some of the initial results.
I can unmute now. Can
Oh,
you hear
great.
me? Yeah, I was just surprised. It seems like, I guess, where it says the methane emissions are generally highest near the ditch in restored systems. So I was trying to figure out if it's a restored system. I don't know if you filled in the ditches or not, but I was just surprised that the methane release would be highest there. But again, I wasn't sure I was understanding that. And then lowest methane near the ditch. I thought the ditches would be the most impactful and therefore releasing the most methane near the ditch in unrestored systems. And I wasn't sure about the ditches in restored systems. So maybe you could help me understand.
So that in the restored systems, they're not filling in the ditches by and large, just little bits of it to dam it up. So there's a lot of methane coming off the open water, and that's been a thing. Yeah, that's been found. Many studies, I mean, that these open water areas are emitting methane. The rest of the restored peatland, where you don't have them standing impounded water, it's not as much. It's more in balance.
So the methane's coming out of the water more because you've got anaerobic conditions there and open water, and so it can kind of bubble up. That's what I was confused by, because it was saying near the ditch, so I wasn't thinking you were talking about the open water.
Yeah, it's more the open water, and then I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure what the near the ditch. I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, I know. Like in the ditched ones, where it's been totally drained, the methane is low because it's not anaerobic unless you start getting further away from the ditch.
Gotcha. Okay,
yeah.
Thanks. That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, so and that's been one of the things we've been talking about. I mean, with Mark and others from this peat group is that if you could restore them in a way where there wasn't so much standing impounded water, you could reduce that methane effect. But that's more costly and time consuming than just blocking them up. Oh, anyway, all right.
Thanks, Chris. I know that was unprompted, I guess. Thanks. Any other questions for any of us, or just points for discussion more broadly about peatlands? Great. Well, thanks everyone for having us. I'm putting a link to a story map that so we had some seasonal staff create related to peatland restoration in Minnesota, and so it has just some more examples of folks that are either doing research or doing restoration that maybe there are probably a lot of people that you've worked with in the past as well.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.